Meet Brian. With a phone to his ear and a forced smile on his face, he says yes, accepting the senior director of regulatory affairs role at a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey. He ends the call with, "Thank you so much for this opportunity. I look forward to getting started." He puts the phone down and stares out the window. And instead of feeling excited or relieved, he feels nervous, doubtful, and worried. In the past 5 years, Brian has been laid off 3 times. And during these gaps, he's asked himself hard questions. Why was he let go? What does he need to change? What might he be missing? In the past, he blamed it on office politics and bad luck, but 3 layoffs in 5 years has him realizing that he might be missing something crucial. And he's nervous about repeating past mistakes, doubtful of his leadership ability, and worried that he's going to fail in this new role. The first layoff happened before the pandemic, after 10 years at a pharmaceutical company in New York. It was his first leadership role, and while he wasn't always the most popular, he believed he was respected for his tenacity. He often bumped heads with team members, expecting them to work weekends and evenings just like him. Despite the tension, he believed that results mattered most. That belief was shattered by an anonymous survey revealing that his team felt unsupported. And when the organization downsized, he was one of the first to go. Brian found another role a few months later, but was laid off when COVID hit. He often clashed with his manager, feeling that she was too passive. He spoke his mind in meetings, unknowingly making her feel undermined. The most recent layoff was the real eye-opener. During a meeting with stakeholders, the head of sales was complaining about unresolved bugs in the CRM. Frustration bubbling, Bryant lost his cool when asked, "So what are you going to do about it?" He snapped, raised his voice, and slammed his hands on the table. The room fell silent. After a long pause, Bryant walked out. 2 weeks later, he was given his notice. Since then, Brian has realized that he is the common denominator. He struggles to control his temper, manage disruptive emotions, and his passion for excellence often intimidates others. Now, staring out the window after accepting a new job, he wonders, how do I fix this? In today's episode, Dr. Clara Seeger and I will discuss how Brian can better regulate his emotions to be a more effective and balanced leader. Dr. Seeger is an accredited coach, corporate facilitator, speaker, and author. She works with international companies and individuals, delivering mindfulness interventions, neuroscience-based leadership development, and executive coaching. I'm excited to hear Dr. Seeger's advice for Brian on how to manage his emotions and become a more effective servant leader. My name is Jay Abbasi, and welcome to Unstuck. Real people, real stories, real solutions. While the details are changed to protect anonymity, what you just heard is based on a true story of challenges that come up in the real world. And we discuss how to navigate these environments with practical tips to help you get unstuck and build a more fulfilling, impactful, and balanced life and career. So Clara, I've known you for years, and you have done a wonderful job of pairing ancient contemplative wisdom and with modern neuroscience, modern psychology, mindfulness, meditation, which is why I think you're the perfect person to talk about what Brian's going through. But one thing I learned about you recently was that in a previous life, you were in investment banking. And it got me curious as to what sparked the change in you. What happened that led for you to take the road that you've been on these last number of years and to do the work you're doing now?
Great question. Yeah, that's so investment banking, that was an adventure and it was an experiment, and one that I think I knew I wasn't going to stay in it for very long. I did stay in it for a few years, and it was very interesting for me also. Maybe that sounds strange, but intellectually interesting, because I came from a humanities background. My PhD is in literature. So when I entered investment banking, it was the most unlikely thing I could have possibly done. And everybody was very surprised that I actually did that. And so it was very interesting. I just, I was curious about this completely alien world to me, and so that's kind of the incentive, and wanting a proper job rather than waiting in academia, and to see whether I could find a permanent job with tenure and all that stuff. So I went into investment banking with an open mind, with the intellectual curiosity, but after a few years, I just found that I wasn't developing enough. I mean, there was a certain amount of development and learning and growth, and after a while, it stagnated, and I didn't get the support or the nurturing that I was hoping for to progress further, and um, to really deepen my understanding, deepen my expertise. It was very much on the surface, and it was very pressurized. My working hours, my work-life balance, all that were terrible. I mean, towards the end of my time there, I was just working round the clock sort of thing. I've just got 14-hour days and not having any time and traveling all the time. It was a proper frontline, job. And yeah, I felt that I wasn't really thriving anymore.
Mm,
And also, it was very one sided, very much about performance, but without the underpinnings, without the ability to grow and develop and really gain expertise, because everything was so fast paced, so pressurized. And there wasn't the time to really read the reports properly and the analysis, and really inform myself on a deeper level, because I had to talk to clients all the time. I had to meet clients all the time. I had to travel. I had to do the day to day work without having time to really build those foundations properly. And also, this whole issue of being so much under pressure, being so having such a skewed work-life balance, it just wasn't sustainable. And you know
yeah.
that I like the word sustainable and sustainable well-being. Well, there wasn't very much there, and there wasn't at the time. And I think that might have changed because it's quite a few years ago now. There wasn't anything in terms of coaching or support, mentoring. That wasn't really a big thing at the time, and so I didn't get that support, and I felt that I wasn't in the right place, and my heart and my soul, my mind were not flourishing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't sustainable, and I really wanted to help others um, find greater meaning, greater fulfillment. And so when I came across coaching as an option, I knew that was it. I wanted to train as a coach, and I wanted to work with people like me in those days of banking, and help those people really thrive, whether that would be in the workplace in that kind of role, or some people obviously leave the role and go somewhere else or do something completely different, like I did.
Yeah.
um so yeah, so
Yeah.
I guess a bit
Well,
of a nice.
you had the experience of what it was like to be the or what your clients go through now, right? You had that
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
And so I think oftentimes that really helps the coach, the facilitator, the trainer to have even more passion, more compassion for the people that we
yeah.
serve. I can relate to that. Many years working at Tesla and seeing
Mhm.
people burn themselves out, seeing people really struggle. Now, for a place that it was also very there was a very mission driven place, so there was a lot of
Mm.
good there as well. It
Yes.
was just how do you strike that balance
Yeah.
skillfully? And one way that you reference another word. You mentioned sustainable, but you reference another word a lot, and it's the word cultivate. I've heard you use the word
Mm.
cultivate quite a bit. You refer to it
Yeah.
as cultivating a balanced mind. So can you talk
Mm.
about that
Mm.
word cultivate? Why is that a word you use so much? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I love that you pick me up on that, because it's such it's such a word that's so close to my heart.
Yeah.
And it goes really well with sustainable well-being, which is the other expression I use a lot. So it's really this idea that there are two types of well-being. There is the what's also called hedonic well-being. So that's the kind of stimulus-driven well-being that the pleasure that arises in response to pleasant stimuli or external triggers. Let's put it that way. So we eat a nice meal, we feel pleasure. We have a nice conversation with someone, we feel pleasure. Once the stimulus is gone, when the meal is over, the conversation is gone, the stimulus goes. So that kind of pleasure, it may be very meaningful. It doesn't have to be um, vulgar or superficial. It can be really meaningful. It could be a really meaningful conversation. But the pleasure that it will give us is temporary. So it will fade unless we keep it alive through memory, which is also a stimulus. And then the memory fades, and then the stimulus is gone, and the pleasure is gone. So, and our society is very much driven by that kind of stimulus driven pleasure. And the stimulus can be material, it can be sensory, it can be mental, it could be thinking pleasant thoughts. That's also an external stimulus, if you like, because we're doing something that stimulates a sense of pleasure. And when the stimulus is gone, the pleasure is gone. And so this a well-being that needs to be pursued, the pursuit of happiness as an idea that we're pursuing something, we want to get it, will never satisfy. Sooner or later, it will fade and it will become a memory, and then the memory will fade too. And so if we want to have sustainable well-being, then we need to reorient our lives towards the well-being that comes from within. And that well-being can be cultivated. So the well-being that we create and cultivate through cultivating our mind, which means to work on our mind, to develop our mind, to train our mind, to familiarize ourselves with our mind, that kind of well-being is sustainable because we can bring that to any situation that we find ourselves in. So even in the midst of big challenges, conflicts, war, even. I mean, the famous example is Viktor Frankl in the concentration camp, who talks about, some of his famous quotes, where he talks about this type of sustainable well-being, which is when we cultivate, even through our attitude. Maybe we have no other freedom left. Maybe, in a concentration camp, there wasn't anything else he could do, but he could still maintain that attitude, that orientation, that inside out orientation, and working with our minds, working with our attitude, working with our mindset, working with the qualities of our, cultivating wholesome emotions, cultivating empathy, compassion, generosity, all these qualities. These are qualities that we can cultivate. And I use the word cultivate in distinction to pursuit, the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of happiness from outside, which is not sustainable, and the cultivation, very much like the sort of farming or gardening metaphor, where we're cultivating the garden, right? To have a nice garden, the garden of our minds, we need to, pick out the weeds and, make sure the soil is, mulched and watered. And not that I'm an expert on any of that, but it's that that's what I mean by cultivation. So we can. It's not that we will just find happiness within. We have to find what are the true causes of happiness, the true inner causes that will give rise to happiness, whatever situation we find ourselves in, and then we cultivate those. We don't just wait for them to appear. And
Right.
it's not just a decision, oh, I can be happy right now. Well, I still don't feel it, maybe, right?
Right.
But we can cultivate it and see, which of these inner impulses and tendencies and emotional qualities actually lead to a sense of well-being.
Yeah.
And
Well,
which undermine it.
The image that
Mm.
you just gave of gardening
Mm.
really resonated with me. I just imagine somebody cultivating their garden and planting those seeds and nurturing their own
Yeah.
well-being. And
Yes.
the description that you gave of the pursuit of happiness, I do think at our core, any of our psychological suffering always comes down to three things, potentially three things, and I'm just saying them in different ways. One is the pursuit of something that we are desiring that we believe will make us happy. So that's the pursuit of happiness. It is the aversion of pushing something away that we think is giving us pain and we are resisting it, or it's the holding on to something that we believe is making us happy that we're afraid to lose. And so those three things are all roughly the same, right? In terms of pursuing happiness. It's just three different strategies through which we do it. And so
Hmm.
if we go to Brian's story and we consider, okay,
Mm.
he was clearly chasing something through his previous roles. And he's someone who is very driven, very passionate, very ambitious, yet he keeps finding himself in these negative consequences. So what might be in your assessment of the story, what is he pursuing, what is he grasping for that he thinks is going to make him happy?
Such a great perspective on the story. Yeah, I think he obviously has an underlying notion of what excellence is, what good performance is, um, and that's what he's pursuing because he thinks it's going to make him happy. It's results that count rather than the process, rather than relationships, rather than what he brings to the table. It's more about hard work to achieve something. So it's really the outcome. And it's that notion, exactly as you said it, that this will make me happy, and that this would be, I mean, it could be financial, it could be status, it could be popularity, although he doesn't seem that attuned to that particular aspect. But yeah, hoping that through achieving a certain status, a certain financial position, maybe he will be happy. And it's a trap that a lot of people fall into.
Yeah, it really is. And what I find in the most effective leaders are the ones who are very capable of dropping their own egos and not making it about them, making it about the people of whom they serve. Now, where he gets trapped is in his lack of emotional regulation. There's a
Yeah.
few instances where he unintentionally intimidates others. He loses his temper, which then leads to him losing his job. So why do you think anyone falls into that kind of pattern where they are reacting emotionally in a situation that has some heightened sensitivity? Walk me through what happens. Why do we fall into that pattern? Why do you feel he falls into that pattern?
I think fundamentally, and I think that's the first thing really that's lacking in his sort of leadership makeup, is that lack of self awareness, self knowing. He's not aware of his own emotional landscape. He's not in touch with it. He's probably not in touch with his embodied experience either. So he doesn't notice, and that's what we can observe in lots of people who lose their temper. They don't notice that they get triggered because they're so completely fused with what triggered them. They think this is the reason that I'm angry and I'm entitled to be angry. I mean, not that he thinks that consciously, but that's sort of the mechanism, and it happens because he's not aware of what is happening in his body. He's not aware that maybe his heart starts palpitating more strongly, that maybe he has sweaty palms, maybe he doesn't feel the frustration rise in his body. He's not in touch with that. So he lacks emotional awareness. He lacks behavioral awareness. He doesn't realize how he comes across, how other people are maybe they're frowning, maybe they're rolling their eyes at him. He's not aware of that. I'm
Mm,
assuming, right? And
yeah.
so he notices what happens when everybody else notices it. So it's a lack of self-awareness, or also sort of a more technical term um, would be either introspection or meta awareness, or meta cognitive introspective awareness. So that sort of reflexive awareness of what's happening in his own mind, and
Yeah.
also body, of course, because we are embodied beings. So there's always a physical correlate, as I was saying, palms are sweating, the heart is pumping, etc. So he has a lack of that emotional awareness, and he noticed, and then it comes to a sort of outburst like that, and he notices what happens at the same time as other people, which is a bit late,
And then
because
he
the
later
milk has
regrets
been
it.
spilled, and then he regrets it. Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
the first thing I would say is really that lack of self-awareness, self-knowing, which is of course fundamental for, well, for anything, but it's fundamental to emotional intelligence, it's fundamental to leadership. We need to be in touch with that.
Yeah.
um, so that's the first thing, I think.
Yeah.
Hmm,
Yeah. So when that's happening,
yeah,
when he is in that emotional state, when he was really triggered, he must, well, there's something happening within his own mind. And I know that you have a background in neuroscience, so you can really describe in detail what's happening when we really are triggered in that way. So can you walk through the what's happening within his brain when he does lose his temper, when he is lacking his way, and use the
yeah,
word fused, when he's fused with his emotions?
yeah, yeah. So it's when the stimulus comes in, and whatever the stimulus is, and it could be an emotional one, it could be he sees a certain he observes the situation and it triggers him, and so that sort of incoming stimulus bypasses. Normally we go through our prefrontal cortex, which is that area of the brain just behind the forehead, where it helps us down regulate, for example. So if we feel that we're getting a bit angry or frustrated, or we're in danger of losing control, then we might calm ourselves down by engaging more rationally, more cognitively, more top down with the contents, and notice, and really tell ourselves, now calm down, count to 10, take a breather, don't don't fly off the handle straight away. um, and so that's the prefrontal cortex that then interprets that stimulus, and can the the emotional state. Um, and in this case, when we're flying off the handle and we have this reaction, it's really a flight or flight response almost, and it completely bypasses the prefrontal cortex. It goes straight from stimulus to response. And you're aware of that famous quote attributed to Viktor Frankl about the space between stimulus and response, where we have that chance to choose a more skillful response. That gap, the stimulus comes in, and rather than reacting like a machine, stimulus response, we have that ability to choose a wiser response by becoming aware of it. And the prefrontal cortex, talking in brain terms, is that area of our brain which helps us downregulate emotional states so that we don't get so triggered. And it calms down the amygdala, which is that center of fear in the brain, associated with fear and with threat and anger, and the sort of heart of the limbic system, the emotional side of the brain. And
Yeah.
so sometimes when we really feel completely threatened, which is a kind of primal fear, and it has evolutionary reasons, that we have this hypervigilance to threat and through stress, and we fear for our lives almost, so
Yeah.
maybe someone said something critical or whatever happened in that situation, and he was so triggered that it went straight. The reaction went straight from the thalamus, which is the sort of sensory gatekeeper of the brain, where the stimulus comes in, and rather than going through the sort of the high route via the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to downregulate, it went straight to the amygdala and big activation. And next time, and then everybody realizes what happened. The milk
Yeah.
has been spilled. And so, yeah, that's kind of in brain terms what happens.
And when you were
It's
describing
the
that,
low. It's often. Mm,
there's
so
the difference between the reaction, emotional reaction, and more of an objective response. And I remember in your book, you determine this as in the book as mindfulness at work in a week, the low road versus the
mm,
high road, right? There's the low
yes,
road and the high road. So the high road, then, if we were to, let's say, give Brian some practices and ways where he can cultivate that balance within himself, and we fast forward weeks and we had neuroimaging on his brain, what would it look like after weeks of practice and cultivation? What would be happening in the moment when he did feel triggered after he's done this work?
yeah, good question. I think what we would see is an activation of the prefrontal cortex, um, and we would see less reactivity in the amygdala through the work of the prefrontal cortex on the amygdala. So um, I think that that's a fair assumption, because the prefrontal cortex would be engaged, um, and uh, and have a chance to work on the amygdala, which then would be downregulated.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
fascinating how what the research shows is that it's just a number of weeks we can see a significant difference in the brain. If
Mm.
someone is intentional and they do these practices, they will see a change in their brain. And you refer to it in the research done on neuroplasticity. And what we know about the brain is that it can evolve, it can change with
Mm.
certain practices. Now, one of the practices that you have indicated is one of your favorite tips on how to work through anxiety. It also, I think, be something Brian could use to deal with anger, any disruptive emotion. It's called 5-finger breathing. And I
Mm.
learned about this from you, and I thought it was such a simple yet effective practice. So, can you explain 5-finger breathing and how that could help Brian as he's starting his new role?
Yeah, I love that practice. And it's a practice I became familiar with through the work of Judson Brewer. And he has a nice YouTube video on it, so people can check that out. Um, it's really you use your hand, and you trace the hand while you're breathing. So what you're doing is you breathe in, you breathe out, you breathe in, you breathe out, you breathe in, you breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, and then you can go back as well, and you can do it as often as you like. And the beauty of this practice, and it does really calm down your nervous system, which is obviously in a very heightened state when we're anxious and when we are stressed. It calms down the nervous system, and it through the breathing, which obviously encourages and activates the parasympathetic side of the nervous system, the rest and digest side of the nervous system, versus the sympathetic arousal, which is the stress response. So we have the sympathetic, the arousal, the stress response, and then the rest and digest side, which is the parasympathetic. And so through the breathing, and especially the out breath, um, we calm ourselves down. And so we use the breathing in this exercise, but we also use touch. And that's also
Mm.
really grounding. So we're touching with one finger, we're touching our hand. So we have that tactile, the comforting of touching ourselves like that. And that also helps to ground ourselves, to calm ourselves down, to give ourselves almost like with a friend who's really or with a child, it's a good example when you have a child who's really upset and you calm them, you hold them, you calm them down through the hug, through the touch, through touching their hand or anything like that. So that, we can self-soothe through this practice, and that helps. And the third way in which it helps is that you're actually using your prefrontal cortex to focus on something else rather than on your anxiety and your stress, on your anger or whatever you're experiencing. So when you're doing that, you're actually diverting your attentional resources away from the drama and back onto the body, the breath, and really getting out of your head and into your body and occupying your mind in such a way that your mind is not busy creating a drama, creating a narrative of how badly you're treated and how bad, that you're a victim or whatever, narratives we spin when we feel threatened and victimized and badly treated by others. So it really helps on three levels, right?
And with the when you were referring to, how you hug a child,
Mm,
and how that practice is similar in that you are giving yourself, in a way, that kind of touch, that kind of warmth and nurturing through a
mm,
physical touch. It got me thinking about how clients I've worked with in the past, when they have these kind of struggles like what Brian's having, one of the things that becomes a big issue for them is how harsh they are towards themselves,
mm,
how they beat themselves up so much. Oh, you did it again. Oh, you're gonna do it again. You're going to fail. You're going That's what's really at the core of this. He's so worried that he's going to mess up in his next role.
mm.
So, how do you work with people on that? How do you help them to not fall into that pattern of, I am beating myself up about this, and instead help them to be kinder towards themselves?
Yeah, it's such an important point, and I think we haven't been taught this enough until we discover compassion practices, etc., which is really a really great practice for Bryant, I think. To the self-compassion practice, and self-compassion practice then also as a platform to develop compassion for others, which will enhance his empathy skills that are quite lacking at the moment. So this so compassion practice, I think, is really important in the sense of getting in touch with the moments of suffering that he's experiencing, and and noticing the judgments, of course, as well, and normalizing that, accepting that this is a moment of suffering, and maybe mistakes have been made, but mistakes have been made because of ignorance, because of lack of cultivation of compassion, for example, or lack of cultivation of certain emotional intelligence qualities or wisdom of some sort, and forgiving oneself and really being on one's own side, being on one's own
Mm,
side. That's a good way of saying it. Really, like, okay, I might not have done this well, but I'm not my actions, I'm not my achievements, I'm not my performance, I'm not my mistakes, I'm not my thoughts and my weaknesses and my strengths or whatever it is. That's not me. That's what it is. And so there's no reason to identify with all that. But it's important to recognize the cause and effect, right? So I've made certain mistakes and those led to certain outcomes. Now, it's not very constructive to beat myself up about it, but I can cut myself some slack, I can forgive myself, and I can be gentle with myself and say, okay, so what are the qualities I would like to cultivate? To come back to our term cultivation, what is it that I can cultivate more? Um, and what understanding the cause and effect of what happened. I think that's important, and that's often maybe neglected when we talk about compassion. It's not about just being gentle and kind to ourselves. It's also about being discerningly intelligent and understanding that um, certain actions lead to certain effects. And that doesn't mean that we have to beat ourselves up about them, but just
Mhm.
recognizing, it's like if I pour poison, to come back to the sort of gardening metaphor, if I pour poison or some sort of nasty chemicals into my garden, I will see the effects. The plants will die. And, the same with pouring sort of anger poison or bad behavior into my relationships at work will lead to bad relationships and maybe job loss, as in this case. And
Mm.
so understanding that is really important, but that doesn't mean that we need to beat ourselves up about it. We recognize what happens in a kind of almost scientific way, you know. We're like a
Right. And
scientist of our mind, right? And we can
yeah,
recognize that, and we can still be kind because, you know, we're 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 not perfect, and that's okay.
right.
And we can work on certain things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like the word scientific there. It's objective. I use that word a lot too. Objective analysis,
Mm.
to be able to look at it as if you're observing someone else, as if
Yes.
you can examine what's happening without having any attachment to it, without
Yeah.
having to be caught into any of the subjective emotions that may come along with you feeling like it's happening to you. And
Yeah.
one of the things that, and I know we share a lot in common in these practices and how to help people through it. And one of the ways in which I find to be very useful, and you alluded to it just a moment ago, is disidentifying,
Mm.
and how so much of our troubles come from identifying with a feeling.
Yeah.
So how would that help Brian to disidentify with his feelings? Talk to me a little bit about that.
So yeah, I think our natural inclination is to identify with the feelings that we have. I think we're so attached to our feelings, and sometimes that's exacerbated in the sort of modern world where we talk about you have to own your feelings. And I sometimes, a little bit tongue in cheek, say, don't own your feelings because they're not yours. They're not yours. They're just coming and going. They're passing. You can observe them, you can know them, but don't own them. If you don't want to suffer, don't own them. And there's no actual, we can investigate as sort of, again, like scientists, and say, is there anything about the feelings that makes them mine? And it's a challenge, but I bet you you won't find anything, right? The fact that you're witnessing them and that you know about them doesn't make them yours. In the same way as, I'm seeing this glass of water here. Um, just because I see it doesn't make it mine, right? It doesn't make it mine. What I hear is not my sound, right? So whatever comes to us, we're witnessing it, we're aware of it, but we don't have to lay claim to it as if it belongs to us, or even worse, it's part of our identity or it is us. And when we say, I am angry, we are equating ourselves with the state of anger. And it's
Mhm.
almost like our whole world collapses down into this one thing, the anger. And imagine, all the other things that are part of our makeup, you know, and we're identifying with one mental event that will be forgotten in maybe 5 minutes, theoretically, if we don't dwell on it, if we don't hang on to it and cling to it and elaborate on it and create stories and narratives and dramas, and which is what we do. If we just leave the emotions as they are, just witnessing them, seeing them dispassionately as if they're someone else's, they will go, right? They will go, and that would be very helpful. That would be very helpful
Absolutely.
for anyone.
Absolutely. A- Anger is in me, or there is an experience of anger,
Yes,
rather than I am angry.
yes, yes,
Even the
absolutely.
language itself has an underlying meaning that we cling to. So what are
Yes.
we telling ourselves, and what is Brian telling himself in that moment of anger? And I love the way you worded that. What about this feeling makes me feel like it's mine? What about
Mm.
the I never heard it that way, and it definitely
Mm,
hit me right when you said it, because that is a wonderful question to bring to one's awareness in the instance where they feel that cling towards the feeling. And
yeah.
one thing that, of course, we want to, well, we have to be able to be intentional about how we cultivate the balanced mind the way we're talking about here. And how we are intentional, and you've written about this, is formal and informal practices. And so if you could just briefly describe the difference between those two, how you define what is a formal practice and then an informal practice. But then also, knowing Brian's story, what are some formal and informal practices that you would recommend for Brian to be able to start this new chapter in his career with a bit more confidence and a bit more of a balanced mind?
So the difference, I would say, I sometimes refer to the difference as on the cushion and off the cushion. Not that everybody meditates sitting on a cushion. I happen to do that, but not you don't have to. But it's formal practice is really when you have a dedicated time. You say, okay, I'm going to do this practice for the next 5, 10, half minutes or half an hour or however long you have, and you want to dedicate to it. But it's kind of a, a, a more intentional way of cultivating, setting aside a formal amount of time and practicing whatever you want to practice. So that would be like a formal practice. So let's say you want to do some mindfulness of breathing. You have 10 minutes. You sit down. Maybe you have a timer so that you know that you've done 10 minutes. And then you do the practice in whatever posture you choose. You could be sitting, you could be lying down, or you could be standing or walking even doing this practice. And then it's finished, and that's your formal practice. It's like you're going to the gym, your mental gym, and you do the practice. And then there is the informal. It's like, if I walk up and down the stairs, or if then that's an informal exercise, right? And the same way with mindfulness or meditation, you can cultivate your mind informally while you are, for example, in a conversation with someone, by placing your attention on the other person, by having a sort of benevolent orientation, of
Mm.
wishing them well. You can practice loving kindness. I wrote about practicing loving kindness on public transport on your way to work, for example, the other day. So you sit on the train, and instead of being irritated by other people, you could be sending them, you know, good wishes for their own happiness and freedom from suffering, for example. So that's the informal practice, the kind, or you can be bringing mindful attention to the way you make your cup of coffee or tea, or you make a meal, and you can bring to mind all the beings that were involved in bringing you the ingredients that you have at your disposal and that you want to bring benefit by feeding your family, for example. Or you can transform everyday situations by infusing those situations with greater awareness, with greater mindfulness, with greater loving kindness or compassion, or whatever the case may be. So these are informal practices. You can be in a meeting at work,
Yeah.
and just make an intention that you are going to listen to everyone and take them into account, and really like understand where they're coming from, and maybe what their aspirations are, what their hopes and fears are, or something like that, as well as what they're really saying and how they're saying it. So you can do a lot of practice in a meeting rather than talking over each other, not listening and just waiting for your turn to speak, which is often the case. I've been in many meetings like that, and so mindful meetings are a very good practice ground. And, bringing to mind Bryant, I think a lot he could do with cultivating a lot of that. Um, yeah. What was your question? Was about what practices he could do?
Yes.
Was
So
that
if you
what
were to give
you were
him,
saying?
a formal practice or an
Yes.
informal practice, what would you recommend for him?
Yeah. I think, given that his self-awareness and self-knowing is rather poor from what we can see in this in this example, I think he definitely could benefit from doing some practice. So just bringing, I mean, one practice that I like to teach, it's a 3-step practice, and it's settling your body, settling your respiration, your breathing, and then settling your mind. Um, and that's a practice. I have a free mini course, online course. It's like 17 minutes or so. People can go through it. That's a practice that's really, it's an ancient practice, and I unpack it in that mini course. But it's very simple, really. First, we settle our body by becoming aware, bringing our awareness back into our body rather than being up in our heads where we usually are. Most people, we're just up in a conceptual mind. So bringing ourselves back into the body and balancing the body in the sense that we cultivate relaxation but alertness. And that will give us a stability, a sort of dynamic equilibrium of relaxation, stillness, and clarity or vigilance in the body. And we just observe what's happening in the body without reacting to it. It could be like a mini body scan, if you like. But it's part of settling the body, coming back to a sort of reset of the body to a natural state, which is relaxed, still, and vigilant. Then on that basis, which is the coarsest basis, because our body is like, we can be very hyper in our body, very tense. We have pains and aches and pains, and we're not really aware of them necessarily until they're really bad. So this is the sort of first step. We settle our body in a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And then on that basis, we settle our breath by letting the breath just flow effortlessly without controlling it in any way, without wanting it to be perfect in some way, or deep or shallow or long or short. Whatever the breath is, we just getting out of the way of the breath, and we breathe as if we're listening to someone else's breath. So with no control at all. And it's actually much harder than we think, although it's very simple. It's also quite challenging in some ways because we want to control the breath. We want to do it well. We want to breathe a certain way. We have these ideas. And in this practice, we're completely getting out of the way. We're letting the breath settle in a natural, effortless rhythm. And just that will calm also the conceptual mind and the sort of turbulence, the conceptual activation, arousal that's happening through thinking. And the thoughts will continue to come up, and that's fine. That's to be expected. But what we do then is we just breathe out. We let the thoughts disperse, almost like the autumn leaves in the fall. When the leaves are just dry and they're flying around, and we just like breathe out and let the thoughts just evaporate by themselves without forcing them, without suppressing them, without doing anything to them. So it's a very effortless practice. So we settle our breath in this natural rhythm by just getting out of the way of it. And then on that basis, we come to the mind, which is the subtlest of these 3 stages: body, breath, mind. And so with the mind, we just let go of any thoughts, cares, concerns, hopes, and fears about the future and the past. And we bring the mind back to the present moment. And if you ask me, how do we bring the mind back to the present moment? It's precisely by not engaging with the future and the past. So it's in the absence of that. It's in the release of the present and the past, and the constant commentary on the present moment, like of the voice in the head that comments whether I like this experience or I enjoy it or I want it or I don't want it. We let go of that as well. And by not doing that, which is what we normally do, our mind will just settle in the present moment. That's what remains when we're not engaging in these other things. We're not investing conceptual energy, because it's really the conceptual mind that does all these things, right? It's with our conceptual mind, our discursive mind that talks, that we run off into the present, into the past and the future, and comment on the present moment. So when we stop doing that, and an image I really like is, when you finish eating, you have your knife and fork, you put it down. You're not walking around with your knife and fork, ready to eat the next meal. You put it down, right? I've done that. So uh, there's a time for thinking. We need to be
Yeah.
thinking when we work, especially, or we're thinking right now. And then when it's done, we put down our knife and fork. We put down our conceptual mind. We let it rest until we need it again. And we don't need it
Yeah.
all the time, right? And so when we don't need it, we're just in the present moment. And so
Mm.
that's the practice. And it's actually, it's not hugely technical. It's settling the body, settling the breath, and then settling the mind in the present moment. And whatever thoughts are coming up, we just watch them come and go without reacting
Mm.
to them.
Yeah. Reminds me very much of the sky analogy, where
Mm,
the sky is always blue. It's never not blue. Just like the present moment is all there is always. That's the only thing that we
yeah,
can really experience. It's always here, and the concepts may be like the clouds that cover up the blue sky, but there is nothing really to do to um well it's in the absence of those clouds that we then get the blue sky. We don't need to generate the blue sky.
right,
We don't have
exactly.
There's nothing that we're doing to create the blueness of the sky. It's there. It's
Yeah,
just we need the clouds to dissipate naturally.
exactly.
And so if you were to then think of, I know you gave that we had the five finger as one wonderful example of the five finger breathing. That could be something that's helpful. What about throughout the day? Is there anything that you could encourage Brian to consider so that it stays with him beyond the cushion?
Yeah. I mean, that is so crucial, and it's something that we can always do. So it's very good to have something like that. And for me, it's really the practice of coming back to noticing what my mind is doing right now. So we can go through everything we're going through, whether we are working on some report, or we're writing something, we're writing an email, we're in a meeting, we're interacting with the people at work, we're with family. Always have 20% of your attention, have 80% of your attention on the other person or whatever you're doing, and maybe, well, let's say 10 to 20% on what your mind is actually doing. So it's not 100% on the other person, because we would completely lose ourselves and we would have no self awareness. So we always need to keep a little bit of the attention on our own mind. And it's that metacognitive introspective awareness, this awareness of what is my mind doing right now. So when we get triggered, for example, rather than focusing, which is our natural inclination, focusing on the trigger and then creating a story about, oh, they treated me like this, and why, and how dare they do this, and blah, 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 actually change that. And it's not easy. I mean, it's simple, but it's not easy.
Mm.
Change that natural tendency to focus on the trigger, focus on the story we create, and actually turn our awareness back onto ourselves and say, what's happening in my own mind? And who's aware of this?
Yeah.
So when we are angry, look at the anger. Don't look at the person who's triggered the anger, because they're only triggering, coming back to our initial distinction between the external triggers of our well-being, of our hedonic happiness in response to external stimuli, and the actual underlying root causes, which is exactly what of our well-being or our suffering, which is exactly what you spoke about when you talked about the attachment and the aversion.
Mm.
um, these are the root causes, and they're internal. So if we are, rather than just completely focusing on the external stimuli that may trigger our anger or whatever it may be, we turn our awareness back onto ourselves. And this is this reflexive awareness, this meta awareness, meta cognitive introspective awareness, which allows us to see, well, what is the experience of anger like right now?
Mm.
What is the experience of irritation? Where do I feel it? What about my, coming back to the body? What are the bodily sensations that I'm experiencing? How does this anger feel in my mind? And coming back to that idea of the balanced mind that I'm very fond of, this notion is, well, our mind is out of balance when we're angry. We really have this imbalance, and we can feel it. And through this practice we talked about of settling the body, the breath, and the mind, we come back to a sort of state of equilibrium, state of balance, which should be our home, our
Mm.
birthright, right? And so when we so these two practices are perfect complements. They're very basic, but they are very profound. So, if I'd say to Brian, if you just learn one practice, settle your body, settle your breath, and settle your mind in that order. And once you've learned it, you can do that in 5 minutes. And then throughout the day, come back and observe what's happening in your mind. And you will see the thoughts, you can drop them. You can see the emotions, you don't identify with them. You see the physical symptoms, you can rebalance your body by taking a few breaths, by not reacting to it.
Mm.
And if you do that throughout the day, and you can do that anytime, and it doesn't take any time, it doesn't take any time out from your working day, but it's really, really important. And I think that's why I would say always keep a small percentage of your attention on your own state of mind,
Yeah.
and not just on whatever you're doing or whoever you're talking to.
Yeah. And the good news for Brian and for anyone else listening is that while initially that may be challenging and it may be having to bring your attention back to yourself, the good news is over time it actually does become a bit easier. That's what I found. That while years ago when someone taught me a practice like this, it was like, well, how can I keep bringing my attention back to me? I get so engrossed in my experience and the people I'm speaking with. There's no way that I'm going to be able to bring my attention back to me. But with some effort and just intentionality and being intentional about it, I
Yeah.
found that over time it became more habitual
Mm.
where I'm doing it on my own. It's something that I just do all the time now. I'm just noticing me respond to people. I'm noticing my reactions so much more than maybe 10, 12 years ago. And so,
Yeah.
Clara, I want to thank you for the time here and sharing your wisdom on Brian's story. And anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about Clara and the great work she's doing, it's enlightened-leaders.com or enlightened-leaders.com. And as you mentioned, there's some excellent resources there, free resources, meditations, mini online courses, things about neuroscience, emotional intelligence. You'll find a ton of great resources there, as well as on LinkedIn, where I know that's how Clara, you and I met. So I know on LinkedIn, you'll
Yeah.
also get a bunch of great things there. So, Clara, I want to just thank you again for jumping on today and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jay. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
You're most welcome. There's so much we could take from this conversation with Clara, and here are some insights and some actionable takeaways. So, in terms of insights, there are 3 that I want to share with you that I think are incredibly valuable from this conversation. The first one is that insight around hedonic well-being versus sustainable well-being. So hedonic well-being is when we are dependent on external stimuli to experience pleasure. And in that, we can never be satisfied. The sustainable well-being is something that we cultivate from within. And with that, we have practices such as gratitude, mindfulness, compassion that we cultivate from within, and it's sowing those seeds, as she used that gardening example, for sustainable well-being. The second insight is in regards to what happens when we don't have that faculty of self-awareness. When we get triggered, we bypass the prefrontal cortex. That's the area of the brain where you can think through things a bit objectively and respond rather than react. That gets bypassed and it goes right to the fight, flight, freeze response. And then we don't notice that we've been triggered until everybody else notices. We notice way too late. With mindfulness meditation practices, you're able to activate the prefrontal cortex in those instances. so that you can respond rather than react. And also, it reduces activity within the amygdala. That's the area of the brain that feels threatened. And then the third insight that I gather from this conversation is that one about the question, is there anything about the feeling that makes it mine? I really got blown away by that, which is a way to effectively disidentify and drop the attachment to our feelings, because we are so often fused with our feelings and with our thoughts. So investigating in this way is a powerful way to be able to let go of the feelings as they arise and not be so fueled by them. In terms of actionable takeaways, there are 3 here that I want to share with you as well. The first one is that 5-finger breathing technique, where she advised to take the breath in and then out as you trace your fingers, and you can do so with the actual touch of the other finger. So that allows for us to calm ourselves with our deep breathing and have that comfort of the human touch. The second actionable takeaway is in regards to that formal practice she mentioned. There was a 3-step process of observing and settling the body, the breath, then the mind. So that way we can witness them dispassionately, as if we're observing someone else's body, breathing, and mind as a means to cultivate the self-awareness. And then the third actionable takeaway is throughout the day to not have all of your attention 100% on the people you're speaking with or on the situations you're in, but to bring 10 to 20% of your attention to yourself and to notice what your mind is doing, to observe what your mind is doing. And over time, this becomes something that then is habitual, where you can have your attention flow between observing yourself as well as observing the person you're speaking with, the situation that you're in. Join us in our next episode where you'll meet Natalia, who is a customer success manager at a media service provider in Minneapolis, who's struggling with working way too many hours, not having the support of her manager, and really finding it difficult to set boundaries. Thank you for listening.